Alright, my name is Sean Fallon, and you're listening to episode 32, Seinfeld. Welcome to From First to Last. Hello again and welcome again. My name is Sean Fallon. This is From First to Last. Today I am joined by a returning guest. He is Gravity Beard. How are you, Gravity Beard?
I'm terrific. Good morning.
Yeah, well, is it morning for you?
It's not for me.
Okay, yeah, just for me.
For your sake, it's good morning.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you. It has been, I'm just kind of sat in my kitchen. It's dark, but I've had my coffee, so I'm up. I'm ready.
That's all that matters.
That's it, exactly. What TV show did you choose for us today?
I chose Seinfeld.
You chose Seinfeld. So just to recap, last time you were on, you did the probably the best drama series, or the most famous, critically acclaimed as the best drama series ever made, and now you have chosen what is critically acclaimed as the best sitcom ever made. So only the best for you.
That is correct. I consider this a great honor to be able to do the best drama and the best comedy on your show.
That's it.
And in my opinion, they are. So I share critics' opinions on that. I think that's the best drama, and I do think this is the best comedy.
Yeah, no, totally. Well, I mean, okay, let me just quickly do the numbers and then we'll get into it. So, with Seinfeld ran for 180 episodes from 1989 to 1998. So, what is your experience with Seinfeld?
I mean, I've seen every episode. I mean, this is... in fact, I've probably seen every episode multiple times. I even challenged a friend of mine to what I was calling the Seinfeld Challenge, where I was going to invite him over to my house, and we were going to watch back-to-back every episode for 4 days straight.
Okay.
And do a Super Seinfeld marathon, and he chickened out, despite a lot of pressure by me. But I'm very familiar with the show. I've watched it over and over and over again. I've got a lot of history with it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the same. I don't think there was ever sort of a conscious thing where I sort of said, this is, episode 1, and I watched it all the way to the end. But I remember watching it loads when I was in high school, because I think it was on in England on, like, Thursday nights or Friday nights, and I'd always see episodes of it. My parents were wild for it, like, so I always watched it. But now, if I'm sort of flicking through the channels and it comes on, because there's always an episode of Seinfeld on somewhere, it's one of those.
That's right.
I've always seen it. I've never got to the point where I've put an episode of Seinfeld on now, 20 years later, and be like, oh, this is a new one. It's like, no, I've seen, and it's not like it's a small show. It's not like it ran for 2 seasons and there's 20 episodes and that's it. There's 180 episodes. But yeah, I know, I'm fairly confident I've seen every episode just organically, just in the world. And yeah, no, I mean, it's fantastic. I think it was definitely, I remember even watching it when we were watching it in the 90s, or I guess in the 90s, how different it was and how new and how clever. Just such a clever sitcom, just in a sea of because I think in America it was shown, it was I remember reading, I had a Seinfeld book, and I remember the block it was in was Caroline in the City, Friends, then it was Seinfeld, and then it was Mad About You, and that was must-see TV on a Thursday night. And if you looked at those 4 shows, Seinfeld is miles ahead.
Oh yeah, and I don't remember if when the show originally aired, if I saw every episode. I'm sure I missed a few, because that was essentially certainly before DVRs. I mean,
yeah,
VCRs were popular, but I was a kid, so I didn't have my own VCR, of course. And if my parents weren't interested, then it wasn't on TV. But I caught up very quickly, and it was on for 9 seasons. So certainly the later part of the series, I saw every single episode when it aired. The must-see TV idea on NBC started in the mid '80s, and originally it was Family Ties. I think it was it was either Cosby Show or Family Ties.
Yeah.
And then Cheers and then Night Court.
Okay.
And then by the late '80s, I don't remember which one of those dropped out first. But that's when Caroline in the City, and I don't remember the other show that you missed, came in as a substitute and was an evolution of must-see TV.
Yeah.
And we'll get into the details later, but Seinfeld almost didn't make it as a show.
Okay, well, how's that?
Well, the history of it is that they were asked to do a project. Jerry's agent at the time approached NBC and said, "Hey, you need to get Jerry to do a project for the network," and it wasn't necessarily a TV show or a sitcom or anything. And they agreed, and they came to him and they said, "We want you to do a 90-minute special, some sort of TV special," because he was a stand-up comedian, and that's what comedians did back then. You know, they did an hour show or 1.5 hour show, some sort of TV special. They weren't necessarily. I mean, Bill Cosby was one of the first stand-up comedians. And he had done some other acting even before the Cosby Show to really transition from a stand-up comedian into a regular show on a network.
Okay.
And so that's not how networks thought of stand-up comedians. And so they said, "Hey, Jerry, do this 90-minute special." And so he got together with fellow comedian Larry David, the co-creator of the show, and they started writing some stuff. And they thought, well, this isn't appropriate for a 90-minute special. It's really more appropriate for a pilot. And they went and pitched the show. And like a lot of shows, it went through a lot of iterations and a lot of writes and rewrites and different things, but it eventually ended up being a pilot for Seinfeld, which of course had multiple names, before it made it to air. It's even titled, it was called the Seinfeld Chronicles. The episode has two different names, and so. So they but it aired over the summer. The first episode aired, the pilot, on July the 5th of 1989, and it went through I don't know if you want to get into it now, but it went through the typical show process where it went through a test audience and other things. The test audience didn't like it at all.
Okay, and
they had already decided to not pick up the show, to not develop the show. That the network did.
Okay.
But they ended up giving him a 4-episode deal anyways. And what was the guy's name? There was one guy that championed it, but he had to convince the guys above him to go ahead and do it. And they gave him a 4-episode deal, which is the smallest offer they've ever given a TV show that they actually brought to air. Normally you'll do 6 episodes, or you'll do half a season or something, or even a full season. But what happened was that they released 4 episodes. TV critics liked it. It had pretty good numbers and good response from the actual TV audience, not the test audience.
Yeah.
And they decided to pick up the show.
Amazing. Well, obviously, I mean, considering the juggernaut that this show became and how much money it's made for everyone, it's even made money for obviously Steve Bannon's crazy ass makes money off this. Just anyone who took an interest in it managed to make big, because. I mean, and you could see that in this pilot, this first episode. That sort of... There's so much stuff that's new about it. And like you say, that idea of a stand-up comedian doing a show that's sort of about his life, but also not really. That's such a common thing. Well, I guess I don't know how common, again, it is now. But there was definitely a period where if you were a stand-up comic... you just ended up having a show like Tim Allen with Home Improvement and Ellen with... Was Ellen the show just called Ellen? I think it was.
She had 2 different shows. She had Ellen, and she had the Ellen DeGeneres show. But no, after Seinfeld, you had Roseanne Barr, you had Tim Allen, you had Ray Romano, with Everybody Loves Raymond, which actually came in a little bit of overlap with the end of the Seinfeld run. But then that's where critics kind of turned their attention. And I don't think Everybody Loves Raymond is anywhere close to nearly as good of a show. I don't even like the show.
No.
But that's the show that after Seinfeld was off, started winning all the Emmys and getting all the critical praise.
Yeah.
Because the timing was so good. And so Ray Romano and Everybody Loves Raymond kind of replaced Seinfeld in the eyes of viewers and critics. It's not a similar show, but it is a comedian taking their stand-up and adapting it to a sitcom.
Yeah, it's amazing. I'm trying to think of recent ones of those. I know John Mulaney tried to do it and failed, and
which is really a shame, because John Mulaney's one of my favorite stand-up comedians, and he's a terrific. He has a terrific history as a writer. He's a brilliant writer, very clever. His stand-up is hilarious, but the show is the other thing is I guess we'll get into the details of the first episode of Seinfeld, but I certainly watched the first episode of the John Mulaney show because I like him so much and I wanted it to be good.
Yeah.
And it was, I admit it was terrible. It was a hard watch. And there might have been 2 or 3 episodes. But there is a much, much shorter leash on television shows these days than there even was 20 years ago or 25 years ago when Jerry did his show. And the history of this is it almost didn't make it to the air anyways.
Yeah.
So there was a short leash back then, but now it's nothing like that. There's so much competition between cable and networks and everything. a show has to make it right away, otherwise it gets its head chopped off. And that's I don't know. I think John Mulaney probably could have recovered. He was just never given the opportunity.
Yeah, I mean that was as soon as that show came on, it was dying in real time. Like you saw him in interviews and like on Twitter, getting to that point where he's just like saying to people, no, just watch the show and we're building up and all that, and kind of like building momentum. And like you say,
Right.
you don't get to do that anymore. You don't, because there are definitely shows we've talked about on this podcast where they start and they're very, very shaky for like the first year. They're okay,
Right.
but they're not great. And because they have that chance to kind of have a season and then sort of refine the style and get the voice together and go from there, then they end up running for years and years and years. But like you say, I think there is a lot of stuff where it's like, now, if this isn't instantly like a viral hit 2 seconds after it starts, you can just see shows just great, like they instantly just start bleeding out, which is a shame.
That's the thing is that in the day of social media can either be your best friend or your worst enemy, right?
Yeah, that's
it can raise you to the top overnight, or it can just pummel you and you have no way of recovering. But that's the other thing is you've got all these different platforms and not all of them are the same. Netflix is a platform that's super flexible and they'll come out with 6 episodes and that's a season, or it's the entire show. Or just on cable, like on HBO, where you're not going to have more than 3 to 5 seasons, and each season's going to have 11 to 13 episodes.
Yeah.
And so in those environments, you can't afford to have an entire season that's bad, because that's going to be 20% of the entire series, right?
Yeah.
But the network is still the same format essentially. Most shows have a fall and a spring season. They're usually 12 to 13 episodes per season. We're using this word season, but first half and second half. So a season of a TV show is still 20 to 22 episodes on a traditional network.
Yeah.
And so but there's still so much competition. So if you're bad for several episodes, 8, 10, 12 episodes, you should be able to recover, if not for the competition out there in the TV world.
Yeah.
It just doesn't. That's the reason. But the length of the seasons with 22 episodes, and then a show can go 9 or 10 seasons, or then you got the extreme like Law and Order that may never end. It's like cockroach of television shows. It'll never go away. And so you can have a bad season and you'll never remember it. It's not as much of a stain on the history of the show.
Yeah.
But the problem is the competition.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, to look at this pilot, like I really enjoyed this first episode. I thought it was very, very interesting because I really do enjoy Seinfeld, but this was so different. It's hard to explain. It was very much the same, but it was very different as well. It was like the same song, but like being performed by. It was almost like a remix or something like that, because all the pieces are there, but you have the thing of like George was actually quite cool and sort of knew things and was quite clever. And then obviously there was no Elaine, which was weird. And there was the way it was shot was quite different. Like when Jerry's doing his stand up and the camera was like behind him and stuff like that. I was like, yeah, this is really cool. And I think it was. I can imagine this coming out in 1989, and I guess the right audience, I guess, would have just been like, this is brilliant, this is fresh, this is new, this is something really cool. How did you feel watching this pilot recently for this podcast?
Here are my thoughts, and a lot of them are aligned with what you said. So it had all the elements. That's the benefit of doing it the way that you do it on your show, is you watch the first episode and then the last episode. So you're able to compare the very first to the very end. And so even the very first episode, the pilot episode, had this exact same elements as the last episode. But there were a couple of differences. One is in the early episodes, he had stand-up throughout the show, whereas as now at the end, he just did it kind of at the beginning and the end. But I found that the jokes were still funny. They were still fresh. I actually didn't make the observation that you made about George, which I thought that's true. He was kind of cool, whereas as the show developed on, he wasn't cool at all.
No,
like, he was never cool. He was always the guy that was was really struggling in that area. But he kind of had a leg up in that initial conversation with Jerry, which that never happened again as the show developed.
Yeah,
it's always George that's making mistakes and stumbling through things, and it's Jerry that has the answers.
Yeah,
the absence of Elaine was very, very obvious. if you've got a history of the show, and she had such an important element. Now, an interesting note about that is that the waitress that approaches them at the table, she was originally supposed to be the fourth cast member.
See, yeah, I thought of that when I was watching it, because I've got that in my notes. I was like, she definitely felt as though they were gearing her up to be more of a character.
Well, what happened is that she rewrote her part and submitted it to Larry David. And, well, this is at least legend. Jerry says that this didn't happen. The legend is that she rewrote her part, Lee Garlington, and submitted it to Larry David, and he was offended that she rewrote it and decided to write her out of the show.
Wow.
So, yeah, a couple of other notes that I made. Now, again, in the end episodes, it's not as obvious. But throughout the show, the series, especially in the first episode, the clothes that each of the characters wore were just terrible.
Yeah.
They were, and I grew up in the '80s, so even for the '80s, these clothes were terrible. The ones that he wore on stage, the ones that they wore in the show, like the scene where it opens up and he's about to sit down and watch the baseball game and delay on his VCR, and he's wearing this bright blue sweatshirt and these red pants. Like, what are you wearing? Like, it's unbelievable. Like the clothes are awful. George has more hair. There's some different things. The theme song, which I read about, that opened that show, the pilot episode, was actually replaced by the very familiar slap bass style that they used for the theme song going forward. Those were all changes that they made. The typeface and what they used for the title sequence was almost like it was so plain and so simple and so low budget. It was just terrible. And then instantly, actually, when they did the re-airing and they finally settled on the final name of Seinfeld, the graphics were much better, and the slap-based theme song was now we know it, so we're so familiar, but it fit better, all this kind of stuff. The fidelity of the music was much better, and so, but to me, the thing that I noticed was that the material was still really, really good.
Yeah,
the banter was the same as it was several seasons later, just as good as the last episode. Like, the chemistry and the jokes and the material was still there. It's not like the first episode or 2 or 3 had really lame, terrible material, and it had to get better over 10 or 12 episodes. It was good right away. Because I expected, my memory of the first episode wasn't very good.
Yeah,
and so when I turned it on expecting to go, God, this is such lame material. How did the show ever make it? I can see why they hated it initially.
Yeah.
And watch it evolve over the first 6 or 8 episodes, but it wasn't. It was terrific. It was great banter. And George was up to some of his old tricks, like when they're standing in the laundromat and he wants the clothes to dry faster and he opens up the door without Jerry looking.
Yeah.
There was elements that were already there. And I'll add one more behind the scenes note.
Oh, yeah.
The cafe that they filmed that in, it was a leftover set, because obviously when you're trying to launch a new show, you're trying to do it cheap.
Yeah.
And that was a leftover set from the movie The Muppets Take Manhattan. So that was a set that they used from a leftover Muppets movie.
Well, my note is I felt like the cafe looked like the Cafe 80s in Back to the Future Part 2. So it was like sort of neon and like quite what the future. Terrible. Yeah, it was terrible.
It was really awful. Yeah, the set and the clothes that they were wearing were just absolutely terrible. It was so low budget and so awful. But one of the reasons that at least the set looks so terrible is because it was left over from a Muppets movie.
Yeah, I totally agree with you about the the quality of it. And again, the same. You sort of again with this podcast, you do sort of think, okay, well, I'm going to watch a pilot, so it's going to be very shaky, and bits and pieces aren't going to really work and stuff like that. But yeah, watching this, it was amazing how fully formed, I guess it was. I mean, obviously you were missing elements like obviously missing Elaine, like Kramer's character or Kessler wasn't quite fully formed yet. But that central idea of like Jerry and George talking about a girl and it being like, no, you've got to look for the signals, and trying to because all that stuff, like the ideas of like, oh, these are the rules you've got to follow, and these are codes, and these are clues and stuff like that. I imagine that was quite a fresh idea in the late 80s, whereas now,
sure,
that sort of thing is. I mean, I put in my notes like How I Met Your Mother was pretty much designed around that, like that idea of the different games you play in time, kind of like dating in New York. But obviously, How I Met Your Mother didn't start till like 2005. So these are in 1989 doing that thing, and like I mean, I guess it kind of ties into Jerry's whole thing about like his observational comedy and all that, because this is probably what people, maybe this is what people were doing in the 80s, dating, having these conversations, and then Jerry and George just, or Jerry and Larry David just came in and just nailed that tone, and that's why the show just became a runaway hit. But yeah, no, I really enjoyed it, and obviously, like you say, when Jerry came on to watch the Met game and he was in his sort of night sweats and he untucks his shirt and all that, I was like, Jerry, what are you doing, man? This is terrible.
Yeah, the wardrobe was just unbelievable.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah. But yeah, that's the thing, is that this show was fully formed, despite the details we've pointed out. So it was a forerunner, and it was inspiration to a lot of things that came after it. It definitely was, because it wasn't. That's the thing. It was almost the anti-situation comedy, because there was no situation. It really was a show about nothing.
Yeah.
It was either about nothing or about everything. But it was. It wasn't a family, or it wasn't a slovenly fat guy married to a cute girl, or like all these cliches or these formulas. There was no formula, right? Yeah. That's what was so fresh about it. It was still in the same vein that it was filmed in front of a live studio audience and all these things, and but it was still really fresh and really original, because of the philosophy they had behind the show.
Yeah, and I mean that sort of thing, like talking about the philosophy behind the show, like I've read a few times, like Larry David saying like that rule of no hugging, no learning, like there would never be anything more, like, because when you do watch any sitcom, even sitcoms you really enjoy, like me and my wife love Brooklyn Nine-Nine, but every episode, or nearly every episode of Brooklyn Nine-Nine, ends with someone learning something. It ends with like a conflict that is resolved by two people saying like, you know what, I should have listened to you and all this, and they kind of and they're best friends and all that. But what's amazing is Seinfeld ran for so many episodes and never had that. Never had a point where George learnt anything. And that was perfect, because like you do, to use George as the example, like this character who is awful. He's an awful human being who you just sort of like despite yourself because of Jason Alexander's charm or something. But there was never a point where like, he learned anything from all his mistakes and all his humiliations and all that stuff. And that's great, because I mean, it's great for comedy, because you just have this character keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again, and they just get worse and worse and worse, and it's genius. And it's good because then, I mean, this is going to sound really odd, but you never have to develop the character to redeem them. Like I guess How I Met Your Mother again is the good example. Like you have a reprehensible character like Barney, but they desperately wanted to redeem him and make him more likable. George was, well, as we said, George was slightly cool in the pilot, but once he became kind of like an awful, pathetic character, he did that right the way up until the very, very last episode. And I love that. I love that about Seinfeld, that it would never drop into melodrama. It was always comedy. And I always love that.
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. I think, and we'll discuss it later when we get to the end of the show, the last episode. But essentially, and this is it sounds like the point you're making, is the characters turned out to be unredeemable.
Yeah, very much so, and that's so new and so different.
Right. Well, that's what I'm saying. It's the anti-situation, right? Like the characters are not going to evolve. There's not a situation. It's just, they're just going to continue to be these terrible people. You know what the funny thing that just occurred to me? It's almost like the show Always Sunny in Philadelphia is almost like an extreme version of this show.
That's it. I have that in my notes. Like, yeah, an exact thing of just like these four people, and you're like, just four toxic people. Why are you friends? And then also, and how Always Sunny is exactly the same. In the sense of like these people who just the supporting characters whose lives are just like wrecked and ruined by these four like this core group. Yeah, no, that's a perfect comparison, which is amazing.
They're not good to each other. They're not good to people around them. They're everywhere they go. There's collateral damage.
Yeah.
They don't care. There's no remorse.
Yeah.
And they built a 9-season show around that premise, and it's the most successful sitcom of all time, and in my opinion, the best. It's really terrific.
It's great, and I mean, it is that interesting thing because you would think, a show, and obviously Always Sunny is now in its 10th or 11th season. That show just goes from strength to strength. And you would assume that, like, the show, and again, I think that's really a show that has very little situation. They do work together, but they never do any work, that kind of thing. Like, it's amazing that these shows are the ones that are so successful, because you would think that humans should be more into shows that make them better people, that teach them something. Where I don't know. Maybe it's just us. Maybe just like the people who really like Seinfeld and really like Always Sunny are just like, they just like to see horrible people be horrible. Maybe that's just it. Maybe that's the tastes.
Well, for them to behave out of character would be terribly disappointing, right?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, if you had an episode... Well, so to jump a little bit into the finale, you do have the thing where when they get called to NBC and they get they get like a 13 order pickup or whatever, when they go outside and like George and Jerry are both like, yeah, like quietly cheering, then they go in for the hug and then they both stop embarrassed and then they walk off. You're like, okay, perfect. That's... Right. Even in success, they can't break that rule and be like, hugging and learning and stuff. It's like, no... That would be out of character for them to like hug even in like celebration. Like that's perfect. That's because, I mean, it's interesting to watch, say, Curb Your Enthusiasm after this, and to see like Larry David's worldview and then reflect back on Seinfeld and be like, how interesting that you've got Jerry Seinfeld, a comedian who is generally, his sort of thing is just finding quirkiness in the world, and then Larry David, a guy who seemingly hates everyone and believes that the world is out to get him, and then you smoosh those two sensibilities together and then you get Seinfeld, and it's perfect. It's like perfect alchemy. And to move into the last episode, I think the last episode is very much a Larry David creation. There's so much stuff in there that feels almost Curb Your Enthusiasm-ish.
Well, but before you get to that, just on the point you just made, because I've had that conversation comparing Seinfeld to Curb many, many times. And I've only seen a little bit of Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Same.
For a variety of reasons. But here's my assessment. This collaboration between Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David obviously was really, really important, to television, and they produced the most, the best entertainment there is on television. But and so here's the thing: is that Jerry and Larry David are both very neurotic.
Yeah,
and they're both observational. They both like pulling things and pulling things from real life and awkward situations and converting them into their content. But Larry David is even far more neurotic than Jerry is. And so Larry David wasn't involved in Seinfeld throughout the entire run. I didn't find where he dropped out, but he wasn't after a period of time. But what happened? But even though they're both neurotic, Jerry is less so. And he kind of, like you said, brought a balance to the show.
Yeah,
because because Curb Your Enthusiasm is in a similar way that Always Sunny is. Curb is an extreme version of Seinfeld, because when you remove Jerry, who's kind of the governor on the neuroses, all you have left is this extreme neuroses. Yeah, and that's what Curb is, because you have no Seinfeld influence. You just have Larry David, and Larry David in Curb Your Enthusiasm essentially plays himself, right? Yeah,
totally.
And he is so incredibly neurotic and awkward and constantly getting into horrible situations, and so that's the comparison, is that you remove this governor that is Jerry from that mix, and then all you get left is the residue and the leftover of this extreme neuroses that is Larry David.
Yeah, very much so. And I mean, like I say, I'm the same. I've seen like bits and pieces of Curb, but I struggle to just sit and watch a whole episode because it's so awkward and like cringy and frustrating, because a lot of times you are just like, the way people act and how annoying they are, it's just too much, like episode after episode after episode. But watching this final episode, when you've got that thing where George turns around and asks the people for ketchup, for ketchup for his burger, and they have that whole weird interaction, that was such a Curb scene of like, that would be a whole episode of Curb. He would turn around and ask someone for ketchup and they'd be weird about it, and then he would say something and then they would get offended and they'd tell his wife, and it'd just be this whole, everything would just spiral out of control. And also as well, that just sort of, sorry, to go back a bit, when you watched this finale the first time, how did you feel about it?
I honestly don't remember.
No.
I do remember that it was highly anticipated. But I probably watched it when it was originally on, which that was literally 2 decades ago.
Yeah,
so I can speculate on what I was thinking, but I can't honestly tell you because I don't have a memory of it. But I don't know. I kind of went with the current at the time, so I probably went along with critics, and it was polarizing. That's the word for it.
Yeah.
And today, you and I discussed this when we talked about The Wire in the previous episode.
Yeah.
Whereas it just seems like it's trendy to complain about the finale of a series, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Especially if it's beloved. So I don't want to jump ahead unless you'll allow me to, but
by all means, jump to wherever you want.
But so I don't remember how I originally reacted to it. I probably liked it because I thought it was creative. I mean, it was. I love this parade of cameos. I thought they wove it all together really creatively. It was funny. Everybody, all the cameos and everybody. I think the setting of each of them coming to the witness stand.
Yeah.
Using that to parade these cameos through, I thought was really creative, and they were each funny on the stand. And they actually cut a few. The George Steinbrenner was supposed to make an appearance, and a couple of others that they cut. But today, these days, like we discussed on the Wire episode, I get annoyed when people complain about a series finale.
Yeah.
Because why? Why do you have to hate on it? It's the way the creator of the show. It's his creation. It's the way he wanted to wrap it up. It's not like they just threw it together. They probably put a lot of thought and effort into it. Especially in this instance where there's so many actors, you have to bring all of these people back and coordinate and write for them and act it out, and it's a tremendous amount of effort. So it's not like they carelessly put it together. That's the way they wanted their creation to end. And even though you certainly make TV for the audience, for crying out loud, that's what they wanted. So give them the latitude to create the finish, their own finale. But I. There was I'm going to find it. Ken Tucker, who was a critic for Entertainment Weekly at the time. He may still be there, although magazines are failing by the dozens. But where's his? I'm going to find his quote because this is exact. And I was a subscriber to Entertainment Weekly for 10 years or something. I was a huge reader of that magazine, and I remember reading lots of stuff by Ken Tucker. But let's see if I can find it. So Ken Tucker. From Entertainment Weekly, he described the finale as off-key and bloated, and which, whatever. I think he's off-key and bloated.
Nice.
So, but then it says what I said. It said that others valued it for the large number of cameo appearances from past episodes, and so whatever. I mean, it's Ken Tucker's job to crap on stuff because he's a critic and whatever. But I thought it was really, really good.
Yeah, no, I mean, I like you say, I think I watched this when it first came out, so I would have been like 15 years old. But even then, I remember sort of like watching it and enjoying it and feeling like it made sense. Like, I think the thing that when I sort of read about it now or when I hear about it now, I think there is that sense of like people didn't like because I felt like this last episode, it sort of just held up a mirror and was like, yeah, Jerry and George and Kramer and Elaine are awful, awful human beings. And here is why. And now they're going to go to jail. And I think people kind of looked at that and sort of saw it as being like, the show was like accusing them of like, oh, you've watched 170 odd episodes of these people be terrible and laugh at them and laugh at their sort of actions. Well, actually, what they've been doing has been terrible, which made perfect sense. Like, I think the show had... You couldn't end the show, I think, with Jerry and George making a TV show in LA and Jerry marrying Elaine or everyone in the cast dying. But it made perfect sense. They had been awful people for 10 years. So yeah, it had to catch up with them in some way. I mean, I feel like this should be how Always Sunny ends, with them all in jail. Because these people need to be off the streets. They are terrible, dangerous people.
Yeah, see, that's the thing, is that I agree with what you're saying. The finale of this show, exactly like our conversation about The Wire, where people are just upset by it, it was very consistent with the show. It would have been ridiculous, like you said, to wrap it up all neat and tidy and have things work out for them. Things never worked out for them. That was the whole point of the show. So why would you make the finale any different? That's the thing, is that when someone critiques a finale, I would love to hear Ken Tucker say, well gosh, Ken, did you want them to wrap it up?
What would you have been happy with?
What would you do here? And who knows better? And again, not that a creator of a TV show or the maker of a movie series has ever wrapped up their material poorly. I'm sure that's happened, but on the whole, they're unfairly critiqued. And who knows better how to wrap up 9 years of something better than the creators themselves? And Larry David himself even came back and helped write the finale. So everybody that needed input had it. Yeah. I'm sure they consulted at that point. They were consulting the other actors, Michael Richards and Julie Louis-Dreyfus and Jason Allen. They probably all had a hand in it.
Yeah.
And it was cool because it almost, although they did some sort of reunion thing or something later, they didn't need to, because all of the actors from the entire history of the show all came together. So it was even kind of a cool celebration of all the people that had contributed to the show along the way. Like, I thought it was really, really good, really funny, really appropriate, really clever. I had nothing to, no complaint about it. I thought it was very consistent and very good.
Yeah, I mean, from last night when I watched it, I did feel as though the first half, like the New York half, didn't really work for me. I think some of the jokes didn't really land, and some of it was quite dated. Like, I know there was that whole conversation about the cell phone, like, or when you can call someone on a cell phone and stuff like that.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Which felt like, I was like, yeah, that's really not, that hasn't dated well.
That's a good point.
And
I noticed that also.
Yeah, and it's just such an odd thing, like that whole phone etiquette conversation, which was sort of a bit lost. But once they got to, I love the idea of them being like, oh, we're going to have this last vacation in Paris. And you're like, oh, that's what the finale is going to be like. They're going to go to Paris and have this final adventure and all this. And it's going to be like, oh, some sort of misunderstanding at the Eiffel Tower. And then they just completely pull the rug out from underneath you and they end up in a court case. And I loved that. And everything in the court case I loved. I loved all the characters coming back, because you had that thing of, it was such a reward for watching the show, because when they'd mention a character's name, you'd be like, oh God, yeah, that, because when the old woman came out, I was like, oh, that was the woman that he stole the bread from. And then when the Bubble Boy showed up, and then the Virgin showed up, and even you had that thing of like, when the Soup Nazi shows up and Jerry's like, oh, it's the Soup Nazi. And Jackie Childs is like, do you have a nickname for everyone? It's like, yeah, this is such a great critique of the show within the show of like, yeah, imagine if you did get these four people and just presented them with all of the crazy stuff they'd done over the years. Well, then, yeah, they'd look guilty as sin. And I thought that was very, very clever and very, very good. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I thought, to carry it out and for them just to land in Paris and go have wacky adventures and act like themselves, I think that would have been fine too. That would have been really funny, because if you're a fan of the show, it doesn't matter what situation they're in. They're funny. They get into awkward, terrific situations, and it's hilarious. Yeah. So them ending in Paris or getting stranded in Paris or whatever, that would have been great. But I think you put it really well, which was the way that they did the finale and brought all of those characters back was such a gift to the viewer, because every single time the door opened and the character was there, it took you back to that episode or that arc of episodes, and it was great. Yeah. And there were a couple of climaxes, when Terry Hatcher comes in, man, like you immediately remember that. And like you said, the Virgin episode, and then, man, when the doors open and the Soup Nazi's standing there and he's wearing his kitchen gear, you're like all of those memories, all of that hilarity, all of those emotions come back. You're like, I can't wait to see what that guy's going to do when he sits down. Like it was a parade of little gifts to the viewer. Yeah, I really liked it. That's a great point that you made.
Yeah, and it was one of those things where when because sometimes with a finale, like I had a bit of we were ranting about the How I Met Your Mother finale on the last episode, where sometimes a show has run for that point where you're watching the last episode just to see it end, so it's finished. Whereas when I'd finished watching this episode, this finale, it made me want to go back and watch different episodes of Seinfeld. It made me want to go back and watch the Soup Nazi episode, watch the Bubble Boy episode, which is a fantastic achievement. So you get to the point where you've watched 180 episodes, you've watched like 9-10 years of TV, and the finale makes you want to go back and watch more and catch up and be like, oh yeah, that character. Because there are even characters who are in the courtroom who don't testify, and you're like, who's that guy? Because it was like picking people up and be like, oh, that was the character who did this, and that was the character who did that.
Right.
And yeah, I was like, oh yeah, no, that. And because I was watching it with my wife, who's watched bits and pieces, and I was like, oh no, this character was really good because this character was in this episode and this episode, and yeah, I mean that's an incredible achievement for a finale to finish, but in such a way that you could go back and watch the whole show from the beginning, like just totally go back and start again.
Well, so I've got 2 points. One is, I think maybe that's the reason why the fans and viewers of a beloved show always criticize the finale, is because really what they're doing is just, what's behind that is just their disappointment that it's over.
Yeah,
it's this little root of bitterness where they're like, man, why couldn't you just keep going with this? Like they're really mixed. You're like, yeah, I can see why it's over. It kind of had its good run. It needed to end, but then they're just disappointed because they're not going to get any fresh material, and so they kind of act out of anger or critique out of the finale. It's an easy thing to do. And then it's brilliant to be able to create a show where as soon as you watch the finale, you would just be happy to go back and start episode 1 and do the whole run again.
Yeah.
You know, how do you do that? And then I think, and maybe you can help me jog my memory, but I'm trying to think if I've watched so much television in my lifetime, probably a criminal amount. It's just a shame, but and I make no apologies, but I'm trying to call to mind if there's another show where they brought in so many peripheral characters, and they were all really, really good. They were all funny. They all were, played the part perfectly. They were perfectly cast. There was just the right amount of them. There, wasn't any overkill of it. I could think of dozens and dozens of examples in Seinfeld because they had a huge peripheral cast of all these extra characters. Like they had the 4 core, but then it radiated out to the next level, which was Jerry's parents and George's parents, and then you get to these outer rings of these peripheral characters that were just in for an episode or two or came back later once in a while.
Yeah.
But what other show, comedy or non-comedy, had such a huge peripheral cast of characters and they were all terrific?
The closest I could probably think of off the top of my head would be Parks and Recreation. Like they were one but that had a core cast of about 8 or 9, and then there were maybe, I think you made a great point there of the idea of you've got like say the main core, and then there's like outer rings. So Parks and Recreation probably has like one outer ring,
right?
Whereas
exactly.
Seinfeld has about 8 or 9. Like there are characters who were in one scene of one episode, and they just made an instant, and
they nailed
impression. Yeah,
like Lloyd Bridges.
Yeah, perfect example. Yeah, or the waitress in the pilot. Like she really, I was like, oh, I want to see more of her. And if she had shown up in the finale, that would have absolutely blown my mind.
Or honestly, any of the waitresses. There was probably I don't know, 6 or 8 waitresses at the diner over the period of the show. They were all terrific. Like the one episode where the one waitress points at the menu with her middle finger. Like, was she ever on again? Like that was terrific. That was hysterical. I think the only show that I can think of, and Parks is a good example, but it's not nearly as large. Yeah. Not even close. Like you said. The only one that I can think of is an animated show, and that'd be The Simpsons, right?
Oh, of course. Yeah, I mean, The Simpsons is rings and rings. Like, I have no idea how they would ever end The Simpsons. Like,
they can't.
They can't.
They're just going to have to, one at a time, the cast members are just going to have to literally die.
Yeah, I mean, that would be it. They just have
to
But
again, that's a show that's been on 25 years.
Yeah.
And it steals like Saturday Night Live from cultural references.
Yeah.
And Seinfeld did a little bit of that, but not really. I mean, it was within culture, but it didn't steal all of its material from cultural references. And yet they still had all of these characters, right? And
yeah.
So The Simpsons is the only one that and it's even much, much bigger. They have hundreds and hundreds of characters, but it's 25 seasons, and it's animated, and they're stealing from cultural references so they can bring in celebrities and all these things. I just can't think of another show that's done that, and they did it brilliantly.
No, I mean, and it's interesting, like you say, like to have that whole thing of those rings and rings and rings of characters, and then to pull the trigger in the finale and put them all in that final episode. Because, like, actually a great example of something similar to that would be the last season of The Wire. Because the last season, like the 13 episodes, you revisit pretty much every living character from the show, even if you haven't seen them for a few years. But
yeah, that's a good point.
But not in the finale, though. Not in that one episode. Like in this final episode, there's probably about 20 minutes where you have cameos from, I would go as far as say about 50 characters, even if they're non-speaking, like they're just in the background or they're in flashbacks and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like it's very much a thing of like, yeah, we've had all these characters, so we're just going to give as many of them they're due as possible. Whereas a lot of shows have to do that over the final season. Like the final season will have cameos, and each character, like 30 Rock did a similar thing where characters came back for like 1 or 2 episodes and then disappeared.
Right.
But yeah, nothing like this. I mean, the interestingly enough, the closest thing I can think of to this episode, and I actually mentioned this way back on this podcast on episode 2 or 3, was the X-Files. Like the final episode of the X-Files is a court case where Mulder's on trial, and they bring in characters from the show from previous episodes, and they have little flashbacks. But it's not done. It's done for dramatic effect, and it fails. Like it's a terrible finale because it's just not very well executed. It just doesn't work, and it doesn't feel like an ending. Whereas, I was happy with this. Like when this final scene was like the 4 of them in the jail cell and the camera's just pulling away. No, I can't think of a single sitcom on TV now or TV 10 years ago or 20 years ago that could have ended like that and it'd been perfect. It just wouldn't have worked.
I totally agree. Yeah, even the very ending scene where he you probably know this, you might have a note on it, where Jerry's dialogue with George is the same as what it was in the very first scene of the first episode.
The buttons, it's the exact same.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I just think, man, so if someone came along and their opinion was, hey, I think the plot that they created to allow for the cameos, the parade of cameos, was really contrived and a bit of a backbend, that's probably a valid opinion.
Yeah,
but to me, I don't mind. I don't necessarily agree with that opinion, and even if that's true, I forgive them because of what we said earlier, which is every person that comes in gives you such fondness and is funny and is so great. And so even if that's true, even if that's your opinion, you're like, well, so be it. But you loved it. You loved every person because you loved them when they were on each of their own episodes. So you definitely wanted to see them for a minute or two. And so it was just great to see everyone again. It was like a big Seinfeld family. It was a family reunion. That's what it was. Yeah. And they played it out in front of the audience, the viewing audience. It was a gift to the cast members, to the audience, and it worked, and it was funny. Yeah,
very much. I mean, I've sort of on this podcast kind of used the term a victory lap finale. That idea of like you end the story, or you get to an ending point in the story, but you give the viewers that thing of like, yeah, you've been with us for a few years. You've watched hours and hours and hours of this show, so we're going to give you like a cool, just a cool, fun ending where you see old characters and you remember why you love the show. The American Office is the same. You get loads of cameos. Steve Carell comes back. And then the final scenes are sort of like all the core cast just talking in the office. And it's like, yeah, this is what, if you've been watching this show for however many years, this is what you want. You want to see the characters who you loved and the characters you've spent time with. And you want to be reminded of why the show is good. And you want something that is fitting for the show. And I think the Seinfeld one is such a weird one because this is a finale that people still talk about as being a not very good finale. Whereas I feel like this should have aged really well. Like, it's one of those things that I feel like the initial reaction could have been negative, but now, we're nearly 20 years later, like 19 years later. I feel like people should have turned back around and been like, actually, no, this is really good for the show. But I don't know why it kind of public, like, critical opinion hasn't turned back around on it as much as it maybe should have. But yeah, it's weird. I really enjoy it. Well, when I sat down to watch it, that's the thing that was at the front of my mind, is that people didn't like this finale. But it didn't. So, but then from minute one, I thought, man, I don't know why. Like, I really like this. I went into it with that fresh memory that everyone hated this finale, and I kept looking for the reasons why they hated it so much, and I just didn't see it. I think it's great, and I didn't even remember what my opinion was back then, but today I think it's terrific. I think it's really good. Yeah, no, it's great, and it's such a subversion of what you expect from a big finale. Well, maybe that's it. Maybe people just didn't. I mean, it's weird because, again, to use like How I Met Your Mother, like I've been ranting about how that show should have ended and didn't end, but in the end, obviously, it's not my show. Like, so
Right.
the people who have lived with it for years and years and years and hundreds of episodes, they can end it whichever way they want. It's just that
Right.
one rubbed me up the wrong way. But this one is, I mean, it's amazing watching it, actually, just to go slightly off topic, of like that thing with the cell phone and that whole conversation. And it's very interesting to see like Jackie Childs, like, because obviously recently, because of, I think it was obviously 25 years or whatever since OJ, like watching the People versus OJ Simpson and watching OJ Made in America and all that, it's so weird to sort of like Johnny Cochran sort of become a cultural figure again, and then watching Jackie Childs, like, again, like I said, I was watching it with my wife, and as soon as he came on, she was like, Johnny Cochran. And I was like, yes, it's
Right.
definitely a Johnny Cochran reference, like, because my wife didn't, like, the OJ trial just passed her by. Like, living in Australia, apparently it wasn't huge news over here and all that. So we've sort of revisited it, watching all these TV shows and these documentaries. And yeah, I mean, that was the interesting thing, watching all that stuff. Again, to go slightly off topic, and watching it all, and like watching it with my wife and her being like, well, no, that didn't happen. Like, yeah, no, he got in the Bronco and this and this and this. And then like when we're watching the TV show and Johnny Cochran appears, she's like, yeah, that's not a very realistic character. I'm like, no, that's what he's like. And then so yeah, Jackie Childs is like such an extreme Johnny Cochran, and I love that character. I think that character is brilliant. Such a good, it's such a good riff on something that exists, but that has its own life. You know, if that makes any sense. Like,
Oh, sure.
It's not just
I mean,
the one joke. Yeah.
No, that guy's portrayal of Johnny Cochran as Jackie Chow is really spot on. It's really terrific.
Yeah, and it's got legs by itself, because I know there was talk of a Jackie Childs spin-off show they were going to do, which didn't go anywhere.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, that was just something I read before on IMDb, so who knows? It's on IMDb, so who knows? But I think that would have been a very interesting sort of thing. And yeah, it's so weird saying to watch this back to back, and just like you say, the last episode, the close gets slightly better, but they're still very 90s, and like
Right.
someone was talking about a beep, like sending a beeper message and stuff like that, like very
Right. Yeah.
of its time. No, it's watching the two episodes back to back. It's very interesting to see how far the show came, but also how much of the core stuff remained, which is always good. I love that.
Yeah, me too. Well, I'm glad. You know, listen, I grew up in the 80s and 90s. You know,
Yeah.
This is definitely my favorite sitcom. I have watched older sitcoms, you know, whether it be the Dick Van Dyke Show or
Yeah.
Tyler Moore or Leave It to Beaver or all the shows in the 70s, you know, and I don't know. You know, this show is 20 to 25, 30 years old now, and it still holds up to me. You know, the material is still funny, you know, aside from some of the dated elements that you referenced, which is fair. This stuff, I can watch any episode of Seinfeld anytime, and it doesn't seem old to me. It still seems like fresh material. Like you don't watch it in widescreen. You know, it's still in narrow aspect ratio, and that reminds you of when it was on. But I can watch it over and over and over again. Like if somebody said, "Hey, do you want to sit down and watch 6 hours of Seinfeld?" Like I'm like, "Fine, let's get started." Like pick whatever episode you want. Pick your favorite 12 episodes.
Well, so yeah, go for it.
No, I was just I can watch. It never gets old to me.
No. Well, it's an interesting show as well, because any show that you enjoy, drama or comedy, you tend to be able to like look at every season and say, "Oh, this is the high point." Like even like The Simpsons, like I think season 4 or 5, like very early on, because obviously the show's in like season 25 or whatever. I think it's season 4, and that's a season where if you look at the episode list for that season, every single one of those episodes is a classic. Like there's no sort of like, it's not a difference between like, oh, good and great. It's like, no, every single episode of that is one of the best things that's ever been put on TV. And then like other shows, you do have that thing where it's like, oh yeah, between like seasons like 3 and 4, it was really, really good. That's where it hit its peak. But with Seinfeld, it pretty much goes up to its peak and then just stays there and then ends. Like there's not really...
Agreed.
There's not a period of the show where you're like, oh yeah, it was good, and then in about year 6 it dropped off and then it picked up again. It's like, no, it was like, you can put it on TV and pick an episode completely at random and it's great. It doesn't matter if it's at the start of the run or the end of the run. Like it never got tired. It just ran perfectly all the way.
Yeah, you know, that's a great point. My memory of Seinfeld, even at season 9, I never thought, man, this thing is played out. They
Yeah.
should have stopped a year or two ago. And I do remember that was my disappointment. I was like, oh man, are you serious? Like, this is the last season of Seinfeld. Like they're still just hitting it out of the park.
Yeah.
You know, this is a show that can keep going, and they're clearly just quitting because everybody involved just is ready to move on themselves personally. But it's not.
it.
But it's not because it was missing the audience. You know, it was they kind of went out on a high. That's well said.
Yeah, that's it.
But I will say this now that we've had this whole conversation, you know, I've both drawn the conclusion that it was a great show with a great start and a great ending. I've been sitting in this whole conversation trying to be fair to those that are critical of the end of the show. And let me just speculate on why this, other than just being disappointed and kind of pouting about it, because I do think that's a theory.
Yeah, no,
I really
agree.
do, about shows that end. Here's my other theory, if I may speculate on why people may not like this.
Please do.
You know, it's old now, but there was a time when there weren't anti-heroes that we rooted for on television. You know, that was a new thing that started maybe with Sopranos or whatever.
Yeah.
The Seinfeld was a cast of anti-heroes, right?
Yeah.
You know, they were terrible people doing terrible things, but you loved them and you rooted for them. Maybe people didn't like the finale because things finally caught up with them, and they always wanted people to win. Because I'm reflecting back on watching the finale, and there's the conversation between, like, Newman comes to the door and says, "Hey, I heard you going to Paris," and he begs Jerry to go, and of course Jerry says, "There's no way I'm taking you to Paris," and Newman basically says, "You're going to get yours, like it's going to come back, you know, whatever." And then, you know, fast forward, and they show Newman packing, you know, grabbing a suitcase to go out to the trial, you know, and I remember watching that scene going, I'm not very happy about that. I'm not happy that Newman's kind of winning. That everybody that I wanted them to. I think I might have preferred. I was perfectly happy with this. I'm not changing my opinion. The finale was great, but I'm not so sure if I wouldn't have maybe even liked it even better if the end of the show was that they kind of got away with it somehow. And I'll let you respond to that. But there was a note that I read that they actually wrote a different ending to the show where the verdict was not guilty.
Ah, okay.
And that's a subtle difference. You know, it's a 7-page Wikipedia article on the show, on the episode, and it was just one little note, and I was like, whoa, wait a second. That might have been, I like the finale, but that might have been even more satisfying because they always got away with it. They always got away with what they were doing, as terrible as they were. And maybe that would have been even more fitting for the consistency of the show, is if somehow Jackie Childs would have pulled it off, or something, some left turn, something out of nowhere came along, and they got a not guilty verdict, and they got away with the whole thing, and they did go to Paris, and they did launch the show, and something. Maybe that is the missing element that maybe everybody would have preferred.
Yeah, but I guess the only way I think that would have worked is if they'd got not guilty, but they'd lost the TV show, and it just ended with them going back to New York.
Yeah, like sitting around the table at the cafe, just talking about whatever.
Yeah, and then then you could have the button conversation again, and it'd just be like, oh yeah, we just come straight back around full circle. And that, I guess, maybe that would have been good for people, but I don't know.
Okay, good. Okay, so I 100% agree with you. I will make that change to my opinion. That's the thing, is that Jerry's show never got picked up, right, until the finale.
Yeah.
And we said earlier, we don't like it when things get or have clean endings when there's not supposed to be one. And so maybe that would have been better. Is that somehow, like, they got off of the trial, but the result of the trial is NBC didn't like it, and they can't. I think you're right. I think that's the way it should have ended. Is that they actually lost the show, that NBC changed their mind, and they end up back at the cafe with nothing. I
would have taken that as well. I like what happened. Like I say, I like the fact that it caught up with them, and like all these reprehensible acts caught up with them, and they got punished. I think that is very fitting. I mean, the other way you can imagine the show ending would be, they go to Paris, they have an adventure in Paris, then they go to LA, and then the final scene is two actors, one playing Jerry, one playing George, sat in a diner having the button conversation. So then it becomes very meta then. So the show that you've just watched is the show that they make. That kind of full loop.
Man, credit to you. That's another great idea.
But
another terrific idea.
But again, that doesn't feel Seinfeld enough. That doesn't feel...
I agree.
It's too much of a victory.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know. I kind of like it that they screw things up and NBC takes the show away.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's fitting because it works. It makes sense.
Like I said,
it's in character.
Yeah, I mean, two knuckleheads doing a podcast 20 years later can certainly look back and pick it apart in perfect 2020 hindsight, and that's not fair. I think the general conclusion is we're both really happy about it, and it was a brilliant show with a brilliant ending. Yeah,
no, I agree. I think there's so much good stuff in this show that no matter if the ending had been terrible, it wouldn't have done anything. I'd still go back and rewatch and still be very happy with the episodes that I've seen. It's not one of those things where the ending could have been so bad that it ruined the whole show. But I was happy. I was happy with this ending, so it all worked out for me anyway.
Yep, I totally agree.
Okay, so before we wrap up, I just want to ask a question. What is your favorite episode of Seinfeld?
That's a really hard question to answer.
I feel like this is similar to if you said to someone, "What's your favorite episode of The Simpsons?" Like you could kind of like pick one off the top of your head, but then you'd start thinking of other ones straight away.
What's funny is I actually do have I agree that, and I was going to say that is like, how do you pick from 25 years of The Simpsons? And I do have a favorite episode of The Simpsons. It's the Halloween episode where he goes he forgets Bart's birthday and he goes to the store with the evil and he buys the evil Krusty doll.
Yeah.
And within that episode, the conversation that he has with the shop owner about the yogurt is just that's my favorite. So I don't know if it's my favorite episode, but I think my favorite, but it has my favorite scene or my favorite moment, and that's the episode called The Pony Remark, and they're all sitting around the table.
Yes.
And I don't know if that's Jerry's aunt or whoever it is. It's the old woman, and Elaine makes the remark about the pony. And then later she dies in the episode, but the line that Jerry issues where he says, "Why would anybody leave a country packed with ponies to come to a non-pony country?" is one of my favorite lines in the history of television. Like that is my favorite. So I don't even remember the rest of the episode. I just remember later that she dies, and then he yells out his apartment window, "Manya dies, Manya dies." And that's a funny moment too, but when he says the pony line, that's it for me. There's so many great moments in Seinfeld. There's many of my favorites, but that may be my favorite.
That is pretty good. Like one of my favorites, and I think it's a lot of people's favorites, is the marine biology. Again, not necessarily the episode. I can't quite recall what the episode is, but the whole scene where George is pretending to be a marine biologist. And he tells that story at the end about the beached whale, the whale that's drowning or whatever. And it's that whole thing, and it goes on and on and on and on and on. And earlier on, you've established that Kramer's playing golf at the beach.
Right.
And then George is like telling the whole story. And then it's like, and I found the blockage, and he just holds up the golf ball.
He holds up the golf ball.
And the crowd applaud and laugh for a solid 5 minutes. Because it's just such a perfectly acted, perfectly written sequence. And such a great confluence of two plot lines that are completely opposite ends. That just because that was the genius with Seinfeld. You had an A plot, a B plot, a C plot, and a D plot. And by the end, they all were the same plot. That was just such good juggling that a slight remark from one person would affect the other person's success, and it would just they would just wrap around each other until they were just so you had that scene where it was Kramer's playing golf, that's funny by itself. George is pretending to be a marine biologist, that's funny by itself. But if you can smash those things together so violently, genius, pure genius.
Well, let's just consider that they were able to accomplish that not in a 2-hour movie, not in a 1-hour drama series. They did that in 22 minutes.
Yeah. And consistently for 180 episodes. Like that. I mean, that was the weird thing I found about the pilot. There was no B plot. It was just the one central plot,
That's a good point. That's a really good point.
Which is so unusual for Seinfeld. Well, the finale. Well, I mean, even the finale, the idea that you've got that little scene where Kramer again is going to the beach to swim, but because he goes to the beach, he has water in his ear. Because he has water in his ear, he crashes the plane.
Right.
And it's just nothing doesn't happen for a reason. It's everything leans on everything else. It's very, 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 very clever. Very, very smart.
Yeah.
It's excellent.
You're right.
Okay, Gravity Beard, where can people find you on the internet if they wanted to come find you and come looking for you to beat you up?
We're on Twitter at the Gravity Beard. We also have a Facebook page. We've also started another group on Facebook called the Underdog Podcast Community, and then we're on Twitter for Underdog Pods. We're championing independent podcasts like yours and mine.
Oh, fantastic!
Yeah, we do have a website, but I've ignored it. So there's no reason for anybody else to go there either. So mainly just Twitter and Facebook, and then of course the podcast can be found under the name Gravity Beard on iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere else you find podcasts. Yeah.
Cool. Well, obviously, with me, you can find me on Twitter at First to Last Pod, or email me directly at fromfirsttolastpodcast@gmail.com. Obviously, there's tons more shows to guest on, so please get in touch and you can guest on them. Interestingly enough, this week or last week, you pointed out to me there's actually there's a few people get in touch with me every now and again to point out that there are other podcasts that have the same sort of formula as my one, or I have the same formula as their one, and whatever. So there's a lot of this stuff going around. So I think come to my podcast more than their podcast. My podcast is better. I don't know. I haven't listened to the others.
Well, I think you have a terrific podcast, and you do a great job. And let's just be honest. There's approximately 200 to 300,000 podcasts out there in the world today. So if you've happened to have come up with an idea that one other person has come up with, then don't beat yourself up too much because there's so many podcasts. So this one is terrific. It's a great listen. I'd recommend anybody to check it out.
Oh, thank you very much. Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on the show again.
Absolutely. It was really, really fun. And thank you for having me.
And I guess now you've got to come on. So you've done the best drama, you've done the best sitcom. So I guess you've got to do, what's next? The best reality show, or the best variety show, the best musical? We'll find one for you. We'll find one for the next.
If you want to keep having me back on for the best of episodes, I'm happy to do that. And because like I said, I've watched a filthy amount of television, and I could tell you right now, I do have an opinion about what the best reality TV show is, and I'm currently watching it.
What is it?
Boy, what else did we say? Until Letterman went off, if you want to do a show about David Letterman, I think by far he's the best late night talk show. So I am a human being with strong opinions, and I do have my favorites, especially when it comes to television. So man, if you're suggesting that, then I'm all for it.
Okay, I got to really think about that Letterman thing, because that could be a really good idea. Okay,
I don't know where I can find the first episode and last episode of Letterman. I don't know that I watched the first one. I'm absolutely positive I watched the last one. And I was very sad about it. But David Letterman is king. He's the king.
Okay. Well, I'll look into that, see if I can track them down, because they might be on YouTube or something. But we'll see.
Yeah, but I'll certainly come back and talk reality TV or any other kind of television that you like.
What's your reality TV show?
I have to decide between the CBS shows being Big Brother, Survivor, and The Amazing Race. Okay. I watch all three of them. I think they're all terrific for different reasons. I'm sure I can come up with a definitive decision on which one I think is number one. Right now they're kind of 1A, B, and C, but I could probably pick a favorite. But it's one of those three, for sure.
Interesting. Yeah. We'll have a think. We'll have a think how we do that.
I've watched all of those.
Amazing. I don't know how we do a first to last on that, unless we picked one season and you just did the first episode and the last episode.
Yeah, I don't know. Where there's a will, there's a way, right?
That's it, exactly. So yeah, leave it with me. I'll have a think. Awesome. Okay. Well, yeah, as I said, thank you for coming on, and we'll definitely have you back on again, because it's great to have you back, have you here, either way.
Yeah, thank you so very much. I really appreciate it.
Of course. So if you're listening, please get in touch and we'll get you on an episode. Get in touch and we'll find a TV show for you. Otherwise, my name's Sean Fallon. This has been From First to Last. Goodbye.